a back splitting along the spine, terrifying metamorphoses of aging, and exaggerated sexuality. The Substance caused a real sensation at the Cannes Film Festival, where director Coralie Farja won Best Screenplay. Later, the film was nominated for an Oscar, with Farja being the only woman nominated for Best Director.
Substance is indeed a truly rare example of feminist cinema that has gained wide recognition and interest from many viewers around the world, not just cinephiles or art house film enthusiasts. But, in my opinion, the success of Substance was preceded by a series of feminist body horror films that developed this genre and enhanced the visibility of women's experiences through the lens of horror.
But what are those films?
How do they speak about feminism and women's experiences? And what exactly is the genre of feminist body horror? Hello everyone, my name is Alona and you are on the Femme Fatale Heals channel, where we talk about women's cinema and women in cinema.
In this video, I will be talking about female experiences through feminist body horror lens, mainly about female puberty, motherhood, and aging. So we will start this video by exploring feminist body horror films that focus on girlhood and adolescence, how these films portray that experience, and what it all has to do with the curse of menstruation. For the start, let's define what body horror genre is.
As can be understood from the name, it is a subgenre of horror films that focuses on corporeality and physical metamorphoses. The most famous director in this field is David Cronenberg. In particular, his 1986 film The Fly is considered a classic of body horror, and was even one of the main sources of inspiration for Coralie Farja when she was developing Substance. Cronenberg's film is a remake of the 1958 movie of the same name and, like the original, tells the story of a scientist who, after a failed teleportation experiment, slowly mutates into a human-fly hybrid. Among the scientist's metamorphoses are shedding skin, secreting fluid, and developing insect-like features. It might seem that The Fly could be simply labeled as an entertaining horror, but in reality, through the protagonist's eerie transformations, Cronenberg addresses quite serious themes. For example, because the film was released in the 80s, many viewers and critics believed that the protagonist's mutations were a sort of commentary on the AIDS epidemic, which was a pressing issue in the United States at the time. At the same time, Cronenberg himself said that The Fly reflects the fear of aging in people, as the protagonist desperately clings to his humanity while his body betrays him. And this same theme is central in The Substance. If at this point it becomes more or less clear what body horror is and what is the peculiarity of feminist horror films that tell about the female body. Feminist body horrors explore bodily transformations, violence, and female experiences through a feminist lens. Such films often focus on themes of gender, sexuality, reproductive control, societal expectations of the female body, as well as fears of biological and cultural oppression. Unlike traditional body horrors, which often focus on male fears such as technological mutations or diseases, feminist body horrors reflect on themes of control and exploitation of the female body, as well as the fears that society instills in women. So we will begin this video trilogy with what all women who have gone through adolescence have experienced. This is the coming of age for girls and the so-called monthly curse. The appearance of blood is considered a symbol of a young girl's entry into womanhood. Now she becomes the main object of the male gaze, the primary focus of attention. A vessel that is sexual and capable of giving birth to new life.
The myths and ancient stories across cultures are full of references to menstruation, sometimes framing menstrual blood as sacred, a divine gift, or a punishment for sin. But it's always magical and powerful. Right medical researchers Delphine Titane, Rohana Hathotua, Ian S. Fraser in their study Cultural Aspects and Mythologies Surrounding Menstruation and Abnormal Uterine Bleeding.
In some cultures, women during menstruation were considered powerful and sacred beings, formidable warriors much stronger than men. For example, in pre-colonial Maori communities, the indigenous people of New Zealand, the main population of the country before the arrival of Europeans, menstruation was considered an honor that embodied unity with the flow of life. Menarche, or the first menstrual bleeding of a young girl, was celebrated with rituals and regarded as a rite of passage. Similarly, in Greek mythology, the fear and reverence towards female blood can be traced in the figure of Medusa the Gorgon. In recent years, she has undergone a series of transformations, particularly due to a female perspective that pointed out that, according to the myth, Medusa was not an antagonistic force. Poseidon raped her and Athena turned her into a monster. In Greek mythology, the gods relied on the miraculous power of menstrual blood, which was euphemistically called the supernatural red wine provided by the goddess Hera. Similarly, in Norse mythology, there is a myth that the god Thor became immortal and reached the magical land of enlightenment after bathing in a river filled with menstrual blood. The miraculous powers of menstrual blood are also traced in Taoism,
where drinking the red yin juice was thought to grant immortality.
The ancient Egyptians also believed that consuming iris blood grants enlightenment to the one who drinks it. One of the most important symbols of the ancient Egyptians was the amulet, the Knot of Isis, a red looped shape representing the mother goddess Isis and her blood, considered a powerful symbol of protection. Women's menstrual blood has held sacred power and significance for millennia in various cultures, and the aforementioned examples are just a small part of the world's civilizational heritage. This understanding is necessary to see that the further development of these beliefs, superstitions, and legends has migrated into cinema from millennia of history and contains much deeper meanings than might appear at first glance. From here also originate the taboos and hostile perceptions of women and their menstrual blood in the modern world. In many communities, women are shunned or shamed during menstruation, being considered unclean or even sinful. Women who are menstruating may be prohibited from visiting places of worship or not allowed to pray. In some religions, a woman may be forbidden from preparing food for others or engaging in sexual relations. Blood as a symbol of life exists both in philosophy and biology. The loss of blood from a wound or other opening is usually a worrying sign, indicating injury or possible death. In contrast, bleeding from an area considered inherently sexual and not a reaction to injury or damage indicates a departure from the usual biological rules. Following the narratives of many cultures, in cinema, the loss of blood is often considered a symbol of a young girl's entry into adult womanhood. This stage also becomes a kind of marker for the change in perspective and perception of the character on screen. She is no longer a child, protected from the male gaze, but now its main object. This is like an unspoken rule of the patriarchal industry. The first drop of menstrual blood gives the green light for the free sexualization of the heroine, as she is now capable of giving birth to new life and attracting men. She is no longer associated with a child. Menstrual blood was first shown in cinema in 1976 in the film Carrie by Brian De Palma. The film opens with a scene in which Carrie is taking a shower. The camera focuses on individual fragments of her body, mostly her legs and the soapy hands of the girl sliding over her thighs. De Palma is known for his sexually oriented portrayal of women in cinema, so the 16-year-old Carrie was not spared this fate. It's just that the girl starts her period in the shower, which leads to the main character's panic and subsequent bullying from her classmates. Mocking her, they throw pads and tampons at her.
Not only is she terrified, she is made somewhat terrifying. Hunched over, reaching towards her classmates, screaming, she becomes a monstrous figure of sorts, writes Olivia Grace in her essay on menstruation in horror films.
The plot also reflects on themes of impurity and the sinfulness of menstruation. Carrie's mother is a devout believer who did not tell her daughter about menstruation and bodily changes because she considers it sinful.
You're a woman now.
Why didn't you tell me, Mama?
And God made Eve from the rib of Adam. And Eve was weak and loosed the raven on the world. And the raven was called sin. I can see your dirty pillows. Everyone will.
Breasts, Mama. They're called breasts. And every woman has them.
The film frames menstruation as a thing of self-inflicted sexuality, not a natural part of puberty. As noted in the article, Film and Menstruation, why are periods depicted as monstrous?
In the novel on which the film is based, Stephen King continues to develop the theme of unstoppable blood. The onset of menstruation becomes a catalyst for the release of Carrie's repressed anger and pain, which had been building up for years due to the oppression from classmates and her mother's cruelty. The parallel between the emergence of Carrie's destructive telekinetic abilities and her menstruation is evident. They appear simultaneously and symbolize the transition into a new, uncontrollable, yet incredibly powerful stage of the heroine's life. King continues to develop the theme of the menstrual curse and blood as a catalyst throughout the plot. At the prom, Carrie is drenched in pig's blood, and this becomes the final straw in her attempts to restrain her power. Her anger and despair erupt into a paranormal nightmare, giving the girl the power to destroy everyone who has harmed her.
No longer a child, nor an impotent victim, she uses her newfound fertile femininity as a deadly weapon of revenge, writes Tabitha Wood, in an exploration of menstruation in horror and dark fiction.
Similarly, another work by King presents the combination of the horror of growing up and menstruation. The character Beverly Marsh in the book It, and accordingly in its 1990 and 2017 film adaptations, is going through adolescence when the town begins to be terrorized by the embodiment of all fears, the clown Pennywise. Like Carrie, Beverly experiences trauma from various sources of violence. In her case, it's physical and sexual abuse from her father, as well as objectification and sexualization by both peers and adult men. A key scene that combines the fear of growing up and the sexualization of one's body is the moment with the sink filling with blood, splattering everything around. Beverly gets scared and calls her father to the bathroom, but he doesn't see the blood and leaves the girl to deal with her fears alone. Comparing the two adaptations, author Tabitha Wood notes an interesting detail. In the 2017 film, the boys from the Losers Club come to Beverly, and unlike her father, they see the blood-soaked walls. What follows is a scene where all the boys diligently help Beverly clean every bloodstain from the surfaces. They are by her side to support her.
The menstrual curse theme also appears in the 2000 film Ginger Snaps.
The film tells the story of two teenage sisters, Bridget and Ginger Fitzgerald, who face the challenges of puberty and sexual maturation, drawing a parallel between the changes in the female body and the transformation into a werewolf. In the plot, Ginger is attacked and bitten by a werewolf. Thus, the onset of menstruation and the phases of the lunar calendar, which are often associated with werewolf transformations, are inextricably linked. Ginger starts growing hair in unusual places, and her behavior becomes more aggressive and sexually oriented. The heroine's sister Bridget anxiously takes notice of this, but Ginger denies these suspicious changes, explaining everything as normal hormonal reactions.
Just got my period. Okay. Now, I've got weird hairs. So what? That means I've got hormones, and they may make me butt ugly, but they do not make me a monster.
Terror of the heroine's transformation is emphasized by her sexual insatiability, such as when she engages in unprotected sexual relations with a guy and uses sex as an assertion of her power and dominance.
I get this ache, and I thought it was for sex, but it's to tear everything into fucking pieces.
The film has a more feminist perspective regarding the onset of menstruation itself. The girl's mother is delighted by Ginger's first menstruation, although the girl's father clearly feels disgusted by the topic. Overall, the film includes commentary on the connection between mothers and daughters, and Ginger's mother is not at all frightened by her daughter's monstrous nature. The changes in Ginger's behavior and character are progressing. Eventually, she becomes the absolute embodiment of a monster, which, combined with fears regarding female emancipation and power, leads to the infamous unequivocal ending that is common for most similar heroines.
Typically, as is often the fate of female characters in horror, both Carrie and Ginger meet untimely ends. Their powers are so immense that they become unstable, driven by revenge or desire. It's a narrative we are told repeatedly in fiction and real life. That time of the month makes women go crazy. They are irrational, dangerous, and unhinged. Just like a beast or monster, you cannot reason with them, writes Tabitha Wood.
This painful combination of the image of a woman who has snapped and a monster that needs to be subdued carries much deeper psychological narratives.
In her work, Monster Pains, Masochism, Menstruation, and Identification in the Horror Film, Aviva Briefel writes that if horror films strictly followed a gender binary, the other side of monstrous suffering would be masochism and menstruation. Through their contrasting portrayals, they provoke discomfort in a conservative, binary-minded audience in distinctly gendered ways.
Revolt also writes about how gender does not escape identification in the tropes of horror films. In her essay, Menstruation in Horror Films, Stigma and Stereotypes, Ishani Ray interprets this statement as follows.
In contrast to the masochist self-mutilation perpetually attributed to apparently male monsters, the femme monster takes a different route of taking revenge for the abuse they faced earlier, or instead is psychologically motivated. Similarly, Revolt describes how the female monster is often shown menstruating before her final outburst, even when she tries to suppress her monstrous nature, as seen in the ending of Ginger Snaps.
I find it sad and ironic that menstrual blood is the only blood in the world that doesn't require violence to appear, yet it provokes the most disgust and stigmatization in mass culture. For example, I often come across stories online where a man can comfortably watch some hyper-violent action movies, but periods in a film are already too much. But if in a patriarchal culture menstrual blood is considered something repulsive, an even greater fear of men is reflected in the myth of the toothed vagina, or the so-called vagina dentata.
For example, Freud compared Medusa's head to female genitalia and a symbol of castration. Film critic Barbara Creed, in her book The Monstrous Feminine, notes, if Medusa's head takes the place of a representation of the female genitals, or rather if it isolates their horrifying effects from their pleasure-giving ones, it may be recalled that displaying the genitals is familiar in other connections as an apotropaic act to ward off evil. What arouses horror in oneself will produce the same effect upon the enemy against whom one is seeking to defend oneself.
The myth of the vagina dentata, which translates from Latin as toothed vagina, is a folkloric concept found in various cultures and symbolizes the fear of female sexuality and male castration. The myth often serves as a warning, cautioning against uncontrolled sexual desire.
As Barbara Creed writes, the vagina dentata points to the duplicitous nature of woman who promises paradise in order to ensnare her victims. The notion of the devouring female genitals continues to exist in the modern world. It is apparent in popular derogatory terms for women such as man-eater and castrating bitch.
Although most depictions of a threatening toothed mouth, regardless of the character's gender, hint at the vagina dentata, some films specifically associate this image with women. The movie poster for Jaws, which is dedicated to castration fears, uses this concept by showing the dual nature of a woman swimming with a large shark lurking right beneath her, with its mouth open and teeth glistening in the dark water. But the most famous feminist perspective on this concept was presented by director Mitchell Lichtenstein in the 2007 film Teeth.
The protagonist, Dawn O'Keefe, is a high schooler and active member of a Christian abstinence group. She preaches resisting temptation and staying pure.
After a traumatic experience of sexual assault, the girl discovers that she has a vagina dentata, a set of sharp teeth in her vagina that bite off the genitals of men who forcibly try to coerce her into sex. As the plot develops, Dawn learns to accept her uniqueness and eventually uses it against those who wish to harm women.
I thought, when you create a female monster, I think that comes from a male fear projected onto women. But if you go back to the original metaphor of a toothed vagina, then you're automatically, I think, showing that it says only something about men and their attitude toward women. It doesn't have anything to do with the qualities of women, said Mitchell Lichtenstein, director of Teeth.
In fact, Teeth has quite a low rating from most viewers and critics because despite the cool concept, the film rather awkwardly combines a feminist narrative with elements of horror and comedy. The characters deliberately scream and writhe exaggeratedly. For example, in the scene where the heroine goes to the gynecologist and his hand gets stuck in her teeth, he comically tries to pull his hand out and drags the heroine off the table with him. However, despite the mediocre execution, Teeth is still an interesting example of feminist body horror, as the film critiques patriarchal control over women and their sexuality and explores themes of consent, bodily autonomy, and the fear of female sexual independence. As can be observed, female coming of age is a popular theme in body horror films. However, over time, films that highlight this process have begun to expand their scope and now address not only puberty, but also racism and beauty standards. At the beginning of 2025, the film Grafted by director Sacha Rainbow was released. According to the plot, a Chinese student named Wei arrives in New Zealand as an exchange student. She is not confident in herself and has low self-esteem, partly due to a birthmark on her face. Her father, who also had a birthmark, died while conducting experimental research on transplantation. And now his brilliant daughter, wanting her father to be proud of her and to be beautiful herself, decides to continue his work. Settling in the house of her cousin Angela, Wei begins working in the laboratory of university professor Paul. Subsequently, Wei makes an important discovery of a compound for skin transplantation, which takes her research to a new level. But Professor Paul appropriates her work, and cousin Angela and her friends further bully Wei. All of this pushes Wei onto a path of revenge and leads to a bloody massacre. There is a clear narrative not only of a young woman gaining confidence and standing up for herself, also a critique of racism. Throughout the film, cousin Angela constantly mocks everything related to Chinese culture, even though it is important in Wei's life. And the storyline with the professor clearly reflects criticism of how, throughout history, white men have stolen scientific achievements from non-white women. Interestingly, in March 2025, another film exploring similar themes was presented at the South by Southwest Festival. This is a film by director Amy Wong called Slate. By the way, this film won the jury prize at the same festival. I haven't seen this film yet, of course, but the plot follows Joan Huang, an American high school student of Chinese descent who undergoes cosmetic surgery to look white, hoping to be chosen as prom queen. And after the surgery, her life changes dramatically.
According to a review in IndieWire, Slanted is like, if Mean Girls wasn't so funny and the substance was way more blunt.
And so, at the very least, from the description, one can conclude that this film reflects not only on female adolescence, but also on the standards of white beauty. In summary, it can be said that feminist body horrors exploring the female adolescent experience reveal the candid and often grotesque realities of female adolescence, body changes, societal expectations, and the fear of losing control over oneself. Puberty, menstruation, and sexual awakening become objects of horror, reflecting both the internal anxieties and the external pressures imposed on young women.
I would kill to stay home with him every day.
You think that you would, but I assure you, you would not.
Pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood are often seen as symbols of beauty and the creation of life. But in horror films, they become something entirely different. The body goes out of control. Transformations are both miraculous and terrifying. Feminist body horrors reveal the dark side of motherhood, where the fear of losing oneself, the pain of childbirth, and the terror of the unknown take on frightening forms. But what exactly do these films say about motherhood? Why have pregnancy and childbirth become a distinct inspiration for horror films? And why have these films gained new popularity in recent years? Pregnancy and childbirth are perfect themes for feminist body horrors because they inherently deal with issues of bodily transformation, autonomy, and control. The process of creating life is often romanticized, but it also involves significant physical changes, pain, and vulnerability. And these themes have become so popular in horror films that in recent years, the media has been writing about a separate subgenre, pregnancy body horrors.
The first time I was pregnant, I felt like I was mutating. Eyeballs and fingernails and baby teeth were growing inside my belly. Cells of a foreign body were multiplying and dividing as my fetus grew from the size of a poppy seed to a cucumber to a melon, all tracked through weekly app notifications on my phone. I wanted to be one of those serene mothers, cherishing this miracle of life and my unique role in incubating it. Instead, it felt like science fiction. Writes Josie Celoni in an article Pregnancy as Body Horror.
A cult horror film that highlights the fear of pregnancy is Rosemary's Baby from the year 1968. Although it does not focus specifically on physical transformation, the film highlights the fears of a young mother and her vulnerability when, during pregnancy, a woman is forced to rely on others. Her husband, doctors, people who supposedly care for her, only to eventually find out that they all took advantage of her situation and gave her baby to Satan. In 2024, the media outlet The Guardian published an article titled,
Shocks Delivered: Why Pregnancy Body Horror is on the Rise.
In this article, author Gail Sequeira notes that, in 2024 alone, 4 films were released that highlight the horrors of childbirth.
Immaculate, The First Omen, Apartment 7A, and Alien, Romulus.
Interestingly, 3 of these films are related to the theme of cults and religion. Apartment 7A is a prequel to Rosemary's Baby, which tells more about the previous tenant of the apartment who fell into the hands of a satanic cult.
While Immaculate and The First Omen both have very similar plots,
where church groups forcibly impregnate women, anticipating the birth of the Antichrist.
these films underline that helplessness, depicting how powerful institutions, either religious or corporate, treat women as their property. In The First Omen, the restrictions of religion play out not only metaphorically but literally. One novitiate's wimple is a suffocatingly constricted fit, laced tightly, causing her to grimace. When Immaculate's priests and nuns repeat the phrase, "Blessed are the meek," the platitude doubles up as a pointed reminder for women to know their place and submit to their fate quietly.
A less obvious but no less interesting example is the film Alien Romulus. Overall, the Alien film series has been subject to feminist interpretations since its inception. For example, when the film Alien was released in 1979, some critics viewed the xenomorph creature as an embodiment of the previously mentioned vagina dentata, a terrifying femininity that devours and threatens male dominance. Overall, the film Alien has many interpretations. For instance, there is a version that suggests the alien creature also reflects the fear of diseases, particularly cancer, when an aggressive parasitic body begins to grow and develop inside a human body. But the xenomorph is also interpreted as a metaphor for the fear of pregnancy and childbirth. The parasitic nature of the xenomorph's life cycle, the implantation of its offspring into the host's body, and the violent birth through the chest are often interpreted as a kind of perverse version of conception and childbirth. Similarly, the methods of attack and reproduction of the xenomorph are often interpreted as a symbol of sexual violence. Its life cycle, especially such a violent, invasive method of embryo implantation, is often seen as an embodiment of violence, particularly the male fear of penetration and bodily invasion. This fear is taken to a new level by the alien Romulus. In the film, one of the characters, who is pregnant, injects herself with a substance containing the xenomorph gene, after which her child is born as a hybrid, something between a human and a terrifying alien monster. As Gail Sequeira notes,
each of these films also contain harrowing, graphic scenes not only of childbirth, but the side effects of pregnancy.
One of the most well-known body horror films in recent years that highlights the theme of pregnancy is the 2021 film Titane by director Julia Ducournau. Titane is usually described as that film where a woman has sex with a car, and it is indeed one of the most striking scenes in the film. The plot follows a young woman named Alexia who, as a child, gets into an accident, after which a titanium plate is placed in her head. As an adult, she works as a dancer at car shows and has a tendency towards violence, which leads to committing numerous murders. To escape from the police, Alexia pretends to be a boy named Adrian, who disappeared long ago, and hides with his father, Vincent. Simultaneously, Alexia experiences a strange pregnancy after having sex with a car. Her body undergoes grotesque transformations, including a liquid resembling motor oil leaking from her breasts, and metal plates growing under her skin.
Much like in real life, strange liquid pools beneath her as she sleeps and showers. This is actually what it's like. It's frightening. There's really no one you can talk to about what's happening, unless you make pages of notes for the doctor you see once a month, or spend time probing the dregs of message boards online, filled with their own singular stories of pregnancy horror. Writes Natalie Elliott in What Women Inherit, Pregnancy as Body Horror.
By the way, in some interpretations of Titane, I have seen the opinion that the main character's pregnancy itself was violent, and that the act of sex with the car is depicted as non-consensual. And therefore, in some interpretations of the film, it can also be read that This film is partly about unwanted pregnancy and about how the heroine tries to cope with it. For example, in some scenes, the heroine binds her stomach, and on one hand, she is trying to disguise herself as a boy. But she also hits her stomach, which can be interpreted as a message about unwanted pregnancy. Eliot also notes that childbirth is a separate form of torment and, as some claim, always traumatic.
There's really no time when you're more vulnerable. The affrighted animal Alexia has been the entire movie, is now disarmed, naked, scrambling around on the floor amidst contractions.
Titane is hard to classify purely as a body horror about pregnancy, because in reality, the film encompasses many themes and subtexts. For example, the blurring of gender boundaries, the importance of family, and unconditional love. But I also think it's very interesting that the very idea of Titane originated from the fear of childbirth. In her interviews, director Julia Ducournau mentioned that she had a nightmare about giving birth to metal parts. And this eerie dream became the inspiration for her script for Titane. In the best-case scenario, childbirth is followed by motherhood, and this is a separate kind of both a joyful experience and its own horror movie. In general, motherhood occupies a unique niche in the horror film genre. Mothers can serve as the main protagonists who must protect themselves and their families, as well as the primary source of danger. But how motherhood is portrayed in films and horror movies in particular is definitely a topic for a separate video. So if you would be interested in seeing a video on this topic, let us know in the comments. We already have quite a large list of topics that we want to cover, which you suggest, but we still pay attention to this and include everything in our future plans. If we talk specifically about motherhood in body horror, a cult example is the film by the aforementioned David Cronenberg, The Brood from 1979. The plot tells the story of Nola, a woman undergoing an experimental form of psychotherapy called psychoplasmics, which causes her intense emotions, particularly anger and trauma, to take on a physical form. Without her husband's knowledge, who lives separately, Nola begins to give birth to deformed, emotionless children who act on her violent impulses by attacking those she despises. These mutant children, born from external growths on Nola's body resembling a womb, are an extreme and horrifying embodiment of maternal power, gone out of control. As Millicent Thomas writes in an article for The White Lies,
the idea that a woman can pertain generative powers without a man is what becomes the source of terror. Femininity and motherhood in horror are framed as something to be feared, a disease passed down through generations, what seminal gender theorist Barbara Creed called the disease of being female. In The Brood, female is an abject creature controlled completely by its emotions and reproductive functions.
The author also notes that men perceive women as the continuers of the lineage, the source of the miracle of life, but at the same time they are repelled by the very nature of femininity, the blood of birth and everything associated with motherhood. But if The Brood speaks about motherhood and the aversion to female biological functions more metaphorically, at the level of the heroine's transformation and her body, then the recent film Night Bitch, in my opinion, is more openly feminist. This film was released in 2024 and the lead role was played by Amy Adams. The film is an adaptation of Rachel Yoder's book and tells the story of a former artist who, after the birth of her son, decides to stay at home to dedicate herself to her new life as a stay-at-home mother. Over time, her daily life becomes increasingly exhausting, and she begins to suspect that she is turning into a dog. I liked this film, although I think it could have been more satirical and sharp, because the concept of a woman turning into a dog because she is tired of motherhood sounds really cool, and I would have liked the filmmakers to push it to the maximum and create a satirical, absurd thriller, but in the end, it turned out to be something in between a light drama and a comedy, which is also not bad. Of course, what I liked the most was how the transformation of the heroine into a dog reflects the wild nature of a woman, and how the heroine later discovers that other women can also transform into dogs, including her mother. The film hints that the character played by Amy Adams's mother suffered from depression, and that this transformation into a dog and the release of her feminine nature helped her, well, not to lose her mind. As the author Clarissa Pinkola Estes writes in her book Women Who Run with the Wolves, dogs are the magicians of the world. She also talks a lot in the book about the archetype of the wild woman, and the importance of creativity and self-expression, which, in my opinion, resonates strongly with the idea of Night Bitch.
Be wild. That is how to clear the river. The river does not flow in polluted, we manage that. The river does not dry up, we block it. If we want to allow it its freedom, we have to allow our ideational lives to be let loose, to stream, letting anything come, initially censoring nothing.
The film also has many cool feminist monologues that were borrowed from the book.
Do you ever feel like the big secret is that we are gods? We fucking create life. We make life. We are so powerful. I bet men are terrified of us. I mean, look at you. You are this miraculous goddess growing bones as we speak.
I am pretty powerful.
I also liked how the film portrays the main character's relationship with her son, because it's clear from the movie that she loves her child, is always engaged when spending time with him, and overall does not regret having had a child. That is, the film very accurately depicts the fatigue from the process of motherhood, which does not equate to a woman not loving her child or not wanting to care for them, but rather highlights that motherhood is indeed a difficult and resource-intensive process, which does not diminish a mother's love for her child. Historically, horror films, and specifically body horror about pregnancy, have portrayed the female experience of childbirth, motherhood, and pregnancy as a very multifaceted and often frightening process. But personally, I am very pleased that in recent years, this concept is being used to promote feminist narratives. The fact that it is used to highlight the female experience, the positive and negative aspects of motherhood, the fear of bodily transformations and childbirth, because horror films are also an opportunity to experience one's own fears and reflect the fears of society. And it's really great that in recent years they have been acquiring a more feminist female perspective. Aging is a natural process, but at the same time it is scary. In a world that worships youth, an aging woman's body becomes something to be feared, something that can be controlled or something that resists. Feminist body horrors turn wrinkles into wounds, beauty into obsession, and time into a curse. The pursuit of youth intersects with violence, and the fear of aging penetrates not just beneath the skin. Aging is one of the main elements of horror in body horror films. From David Cronenberg's film The Fly to the feminist Substance, bodily changes are depicted in an exaggerated and frightening manner, and this fear resonates with many viewers. By the way, it's interesting that there is a sort of female version of The Fly called The Wasp Woman, which was released in 1959, just a year after the original film The Fly came out. This film is referred to as a B-movie because it clearly copied the plot of The Fly, with slight modifications aiming to replicate the success of the original. The film tells the story of Janice Starling, the head of a cosmetics company who desperately seeks to regain her youth. She undergoes an experimental treatment using wasp enzymes, which initially rejuvenates her but soon leads to a horrifying metamorphosis. As Janice mutates into a terrifying wasp-human hybrid, the film explores themes of anxiety related to aging, beauty, and the consequences of tampering with nature. Janice's loss of control over her own body reflects the core theme of body horror, the dissolution of identity through grotesque physical changes. On one hand, the fear of aging is a normal part of human nature, as it is linked to the instinct for survival. As people age, they become more vulnerable, physically weaker, and closer to death. On the other hand, while most people experience some level of anxiety about aging, women face significantly more pressure due to cultural narratives fueled by society, media, and the beauty industry. And this fear and pressure is reflected in the trope of the psycho-biddy, which can be translated as crazy old woman. This is a distinct subgenre of horror films that portray aging women as mentally unstable, eccentric, or dangerous. These films can also be referred to as hagsplotation, which derives from the two words hag and exploitation. This subgenre emerged in the 1960s and often featured actresses who were once glamorous Hollywood divas, now playing troubled, vengeful, or tormented elderly women. The film considered to have initiated this subgenre is the 1962 movie Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, directed by Robert Aldrich. Although, for example, the 1950 film Sunset Boulevard shares many thematic and plot similarities with Baby Jane, often referred to as a precursor to this subgenre. The plot of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane tells the story of two aging sisters, Jane, played by Bette Davis, and Blanche, played by Joan Crawford. They live together in a decaying Hollywood mansion. In the 1910s, Jane was a famous child actress, but as she aged, her career declined. Blanche, on the other hand, became a successful actress in adulthood until a mysterious car accident left her paralyzed. Now Jane, embittered and mentally unstable, takes care of Blanche, tormenting her both physically and psychologically. And the madness continues to grow as Jane clings to her past glory. This film also revived the fame of actresses Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, who, after Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, starred in several more films where they played similar roles. For example, the 1964 film Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte was an obvious attempt to replicate the success of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, as it used the same themes, casting, and elements of psychological horror that defined the psycho-biddy genre. As in Baby Jane, in Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, Bette Davis played a role that blurred the line between victim and tormentor, with a decaying Southern Gothic mansion serving as the backdrop for the madness. And the plot was based on the tense unraveling of the heroine's traumatic experiences. Joan Crawford also later starred in an exploitation film about an aging woman. This was the 1964 film Straitjacket, where the actress played a woman named Lucy, who returns to society after spending 20 years in a psychiatric hospital for murdering her husband after discovering his infidelity. When she is released, a series of axe murders occur in the town, and Lucy becomes a suspect. In fact, the psycho-biddy trope is more related to horror than body horror, as such films do not feature grotesque bodily transformations. On the other hand, the aging body itself becomes a source of fear in this subgenre, and because of this, it is often called exploitative, as it uses and amplifies stereotypes that exist about aging women. In the article The Leech Woman, Aging of the Female Body as Shock, Don Kitley compares the 1960 film The Leech Woman with The Substance, which we will discuss later. The plot tells the story of June Talbot, an aging, unhappy woman whose cruel husband, Dr. Paul Talbot, no longer finds her attractive. Desperately seeking to regain her youth, she agrees to participate in an experiment involving a mysterious African tribe that possesses a secret formula to stop aging. Soon she discovers that this process requires the life essence of other people, specifically a gland extracted from living men. Using the ritual to transform into a younger version of herself, she begins to kill to maintain her beauty, and eventually falls into despair and horror when the effect wears off. One of the film's characters, an old woman named Mala, even voices an overtly feminist message.
For a man, old age has rewards. If he is wise, his gray hairs bring dignity, and he's treated with honor and respect. But for the aged woman, there is nothing. At best, she's pitied. More often, her lot is of contempt and neglect.
And as Don Kitley writes, this idea is taken to a new level in The Substance. But before we talk about this film, let's look at other contemporary movies that have used the idea of fear of the aging woman. Modern horror films such as The House of the Devil, The Witch, Hereditary, and Barbarian typically combine extreme violence or taboo actions with aging naked bodies in an attempt to create the grotesque. In this way, they indeed send the signal that the only thing that can be more frightening than a woman committing repulsive acts is a naked aging woman committing repulsive acts. This in turn fuels ageist and misogynistic attitudes towards mature women, creating a closed and seemingly unbreakable cycle, writes Brandon Hill in a thematic article about the psycho-biddy trope. One of the most famous uses of this trope in cinema is the scene in Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, where an old woman tries to seduce the main character, Jack. She lies in the bathtub waiting for the next victim of sexual violence. She is dangerous, lustful, and the grotesqueness of her naked body is taken to the extreme with gangrenous lesions. Although this character has a significant impact on the film's plot, she hardly participates in it. She exists solely to advance the storyline, shock, and disturb the viewers, writes Brandon Hill. The trend of using the body of an aging woman as an element of horror can also be seen in contemporary horror films. For example, one can recall the 2018 remake of Suspiria, or the serial killer Pearl in the film X. With the release of Substance in 2024, many critics began to mention the psycho-biddy genre, as Coralie Fargeet's film clearly played with the intersection of themes of aging and madness. According to the plot, fitness show host Elizabeth Sparkle is fired when she turns 50. In desperation, she uses a mysterious substance resulting in the birth of her younger version, Sue. And throughout the film, the terrifying consequences of these transformations are revealed, critiquing the beauty industry, the pursuit of youth, and the fear of aging. Although I honestly liked the substance, I also paid attention to the critique of this film, and I found it interesting that the film portrays old age in a very grotesque and repulsive manner. On one hand, that was the point, but on the other hand, the authors of this critique said that in this way, the film only fuels the fear of aging in women, as it literally depicts it as a hyper-repulsive and unpleasant process. And during the viewing, it indeed evokes fear and a reluctance to age. I partially agree with this critique, partially not, because ultimately, as a body horror film, it aimed to scare the viewers. But I also find it interesting that in the film, only women suffer. Both Elizabeth and Sue seek the approval of the channel's director and want to remain relevant in a patriarchal world. Again, one could say that this truly reflects reality. But on the other hand, the substance, in my opinion, is such a grotesque tale and fantasy. So if at the end of the film the big monster explodes with blood, one could realize some fantasy of revenge against the patriarchal system. Therefore, in the end, the substance turns out to be more of a cautionary film for women than a critique of the patriarchal system. Among the lesser-known contemporary body horror films about aging, one can mention the 2021 film She Will, directed by Charlotte Colbert. The film tells the story of Veronica Gent, an aging movie star who is recovering from a mastectomy in a remote, secluded location in the Scottish countryside. As she struggles with her physical and emotional traumas, she begins to see strange visions and feel a supernatural connection with the land, which was once a site for burning witches. These episodes awaken her hidden trauma related to a powerful male director who exploited her in her youth. And gradually, Veronica acquires an eerie, vengeful power to reclaim her authority. In a review for The Guardian, author Leslie Felperin described She Will as a postmenopausal revenge fantasy film is indeed an interesting observation, especially when viewed through the lens of all three of our videos on feminist body horror. For example, in the first episode, we talked about adolescence, in the second about pregnancy and motherhood, and in this third episode about old age. And all these processes are directly related to female reproductive organs. I think it's fair to say that all these films reflect societal fears about the biological nature of women and aspects of the female experience. When specifically discussing body horror films about female aging, these films reflect a deeply rooted societal fear of older women, both in terms of their physical aging and their potential power. And these films play on the anxiety about women's bodies that no longer meet beauty standards and women who refuse to fade into the background. From all the listed examples, it can be seen that women in such films are depicted either as pitiable victims or as grotesque threats, reinforcing the idea that a woman's value is tied to her youth and conventional attractiveness, which is appreciated by men. However, this trope can be reinterpreted through a feminist lens by shifting the focus from the fear of older women to the fear of how society treats them. Thank you for watching this video. Give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave comments, as this really helps our videos, and it's always valuable and important for us to see and read your feedback. Also, write about what topics you would like to see videos on. We add everything to our big list of ideas and topics. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next videos. Bye bye.